Welcome. If you've logged in, you're at the Making Sense of Microplastics produced by NEBC and in partnership with Eurofins. So thank you for joining us today. We've got, I think, a full agenda and a great presentation planned. But as many of you know, NEBC does a lot of in-person events. Most recently, we've tried to go back to doing some virtual sessions, some webinars. And so we really appreciate Eurofins stepping up to say, yes, we'd love to participate and present on the topic of microplastics. Joining us today is Adam Gushgari. He's the Senior Director of Emerging Contaminants at Eurofins, and also Bijan Jafari, microplastics practice leader. There's a mouthful for you right there. They're going to really kick it off here shortly, but I will say we're scheduled to go to about 11:15, and we'll try to stick with that time frame. If you do have questions for our presenters today, there is a Q&A feature, and I would encourage you to type your questions in that function here in the webinar, and they will look at opportunities to respond to the questions. So with that, and I will also remind you that we will be sharing the presentations with you in a PDF format, so you'll have access to those documents, as well as this recording will be available on YouTube. So we'll share that link with you as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Adam, and I'll sit back and enjoy.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Greg, and good morning or afternoon, everybody, from wherever you happen to be joining us. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. And Bijan, you also now have control. So yeah, my name's Adam Gushgari. I'm the Senior Director of Emerging Contaminants at the Eurofins Environment Testing Group. And, I've had the pleasure of playing in the environmental space now for well over a decade. One of my core purviews is within wastewater surveillance, which is a technique that we use to understand human health crises through environmental analyses of wastewater. But the general realm of emerging contaminants has always been so incredibly interesting to me. And we'll get into that in a little bit as to why, and in this fantastic topic of microplastics. But Bijan, would you care to introduce yourself real quick?
Oh, for sure. Hi everyone. My name is Bijan Jafari. I'm the microplastics practice leader at Eurofins, and I also oversee the microplastics department in our Sacramento, California location. My focus has been on microplastics method development, analytical testing, quality assurance, and quality control techniques. And I'm happy to be here today alongside with Adam to introduce you to the world of microplastics analysis.
Fantastic. And I always love presenting to a new group. I mean, it's so much fun. There's opportunity to, engage in, scientific discourse, to explore these new topics of emerging contaminants with new groups of people, gain new insights. It is a exercise that is not only beneficial for the group, but incredibly beneficial to me and Bijan as well. And, if you get to know me, there is one thing that I absolutely love, and that is storytelling. Storytelling, I think, has just this rich and tenured history across humanity. I mean, storytelling is as old as humanity itself, right? Before written language, stories were used to convey, histories across generations. Storytelling and parables have been used for generations to teach, insights and morals to, new generations. And even today, storytelling has such an important part of our society, whether that is with fictional storytelling for enjoyment or the type of storytelling that we're going to go through today. Now, that's kind of a strange way to start off a topic on emerging contaminants of microplastics. So why do I start with that? Well, storytelling in terms of emerging contaminants also has a very important role to play, because every emerging contaminant that ultimately moves to regulation starts as a story. Now, a lot of the times, these stories are catastrophic events. We use a chemical or a contaminant for years and years and years and realize after the fact that it is a carcinogen or it has acute toxicity or it's an endocrine disrupting compound. But the story of microplastics is much, much different. So I'm going to take you all back to the 1800s, in fact, 1869. A New York firm put out a competition with a prize of $10,000, a literal fortune at the time, for somebody to come up with an alternative to ivory. Now, why ivory, you ask? Well, the game of billiards in the late 1800s had become so popular that it was actually driving elephants to extinction. So there was an analytical chemist in New York that went into the laboratory and got to work. Combined cotton and camphor and created a material, a synthetic material that resembled ivory, resembled bone, and could be molded and shaped into anything. And this chemist called this material celluloid. And overnight, it was hailed as an innovative breakthrough, the savior of the elephants, it was actually called. Now, this isn't technically a plastic, but this is a very, very important point in the history of materials manufacturing because it was the first time that we demonstrated we are not limited by the resources that our natural environment provides us, that we can engineer ourselves out of scarcity. And this concept is what led to the plastic revolution of the 1900s. So then we fast forward about 40 years. Again, in New York, there were chemists experimenting with all these different materials, and they developed the first synthetic plastic, and it was called Bakelite. Bakelite was originally marketed as the material of 1,000 uses. And my God, they weren't kidding. This stuff went into everything, into insulation, into wiring, into camera housing, into virtually thousands and thousands of materials. It was a technological material revolution and innovation. But this started an incredible trajectory in what I like to call the plastic age. So then we fast forward to the late 1930s, 1940s. And there is a company that develops nylon. And nylon, the first primary application was in stockings. It was marketed as lustrous as silk, but strong as steel. Now, the numbers on this kind of vary from time to time, or from source to source, excuse me. But generally speaking, it's agreed that within the first week, over 4 million pairs of nylon stockings were sold in the United States. Absolutely incredible. Just an incredible marketing drive, an incredible technological revolution. But again, this then gave way to a renaissance in the field of plastics manufacturing. Tens and tens of different types of plastics, like plexiglass, were developed for specific applications. Each one had a unique material, a unique strength that gave way to new applications of these materials. And it continued to grow and grow and grow until World War II. And plastics went from a consumer good to something that would ultimately help win the war. Governments literally poured billions of dollars, billions, into plastics manufacturing, developing the technologies, the warehouses, the manufacturing capability to rapidly develop plastics and put them across a variety of wartime materials, which include, machinery, tanks, body armor, helmets, weapons. Plastics literally went into all of these different applications and ultimately helped win the war. And then after the war subsided, all of those materials, all of that infrastructure needed somewhere to go. So where did it go? It went into your houses. It went into your kitchens. It went into your living rooms. It went into your vehicles. After World War II, and especially as we gain into the 1970s, there was a marketing blitz globally, but especially in the United States, unlike the world had ever seen. And it was hailed as a monumental success story in the term of single-use disposable plastics. In fact, I think it was Life magazine that developed a term or coined this term that I think has aged spectacularly poorly. They called plastics throwaway living, and they meant it as a compliment. And that's what's wild to me. In fact, by 1976, plastic became the most produced synthetic material globally. I believe the number was somewhere around 50 kilograms per person globally. And that has continued to accelerate and accelerate and accelerate. So, guys, this started not as a story of crisis, but as a story of success, a story of human ingenuity and human innovation, allowing us to reach a level that we would be unable to reach, a quality of living we would be unable to obtain were it not for our innovation. But there was something that was not asked, it was not asked through the entirety of that process. Where does it go? Not the cup or your single-use plastic bag or your car bumper, but where does the material go when we're done with it? What actually happens to it? How is our natural environment absorbing this material that we are creating in mass? And that's ultimately where this field of microplastics came from. Now, in order to understand the field of microplastics, it's first important to understand what a microplastic actually is. And throughout this presentation that Bijan and I will be giving, you're going to learn that there is a lot of contention in this field right now. At the end of the day, we are a nascent field. We are a field in its infancy that continues to grow, and we learn and learn more and more every day. But it's very important to frame our knowledge and successes alongside the limitations and gaps that exist in the field in order to have a true understanding of where this field currently sits today and how we need to move this forward in the future. So what ultimately is a microplastic? The term was first coined in 2004, actually, by a marine biologist who was observing plastics in marine sediment samples that he was analyzing. And he needed something to call them, so he coined the term microplastics, and that just proliferated. So globally speaking, there is a higher limit of microplastics, and that is defined as 5 millimeters on the upper threshold. Anything above 5 millimeters is considered a macroplastic. But once we get below 5 millimeters, we are in micro territory. So there's an upper limit. But what's interesting about this is the lower limit. Now, there is a lot of contention around what the lower limit of a microplastic truly is. There are some people that say a microplastic ends at 1 micron, and anything below that threshold is considered a nanoplastic. Personally speaking, that's the definition that I subscribe to. But it's important also to note that many people have the definition that a microplastic extends from 5 millimeters all the way down to 1 nanometer. And there are other cut thresholds that some people use, researchers and governing institutions. For instance, EPA has a definition, FDA has a different definition, NOAA has a different definition. Now, you could look at this and say, okay, Adam, well, this is just kind of scientific hair splitting. What does that really matter? It matters because once you start to get below, arguably somewhere between the 1 micron to 5 micron threshold, you start to enter a realm of plastics that have a higher potential of being biologically active. They have the potential to cross cell barriers. They have the potential to have a higher flux per mass of sorbed contaminants or biofilms on the surfaces. As you go lower and lower in particle count, the effective surface area of the total mass of plastics increases. So all of these things then coupled with regulatory action, because at the end of the day, a lot of the environmental field is driven by either litigation or regulation. So a lot of the things that we do, a lot of the analyses that we pursue are based upon current regulatory limits or regulatory requirements. So ultimately, that defining threshold is not scientific jargon. It has true benefit or true impact to both the regulation and the resulting human health impacts that we are trying to mitigate through said regulation. So where do these microplastics ultimately come from? Well, there are two basic trains of thought here. First of all is primary microplastics. These are plastics that are manufactured small and were never really intended to be anything larger. And this falls primarily into two categories, at least currently. The first one that we see are microbeads. So microbeads are small manufactured plastics that are included in personal care products for specific properties like dermal abrasion. Historically, these have been used for like skincare products or other personal care products that have an abrasion quality to them for hygiene purposes. Now, after brushing your teeth or washing your face with a product that contains these manufactured primary microplastics, they wash into the sewer system and then enter our natural environments. It's important to note that there have been regulations passed around some of these, but that's not a global. So in the United States, we do have the Microbead Free Waters Act. And this is a US regulation specifically aimed at reducing primary microplastics within a lot of these products. And this has been mirrored by a lot of other countries across the world. But it's also important to note that there are many countries that do not have these requirements. And in those countries, these microbeads are still included in a lot of personal care products. The other side of the primary microplastics are nurdles. Not only a fun word to say, but also a very important aspect in terms of plastic manufacturing. Nurdles are used as the feedstock for a lot of plastics manufacturing, and they can enter natural environments through spills and other contamination pathways. But I would say arguably, but maybe not even arguably, the primary way that microplastics actually enter our environment is through secondary microplastics. And these are microplastics that enter the environment through shearing forces of various macroplastics. So think about a single-use plastic bag or a bottle. These enter our environment through litter, through refuse, and then constantly shear and rub it against each other over time and fragment into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, potentially down to the molecular level. So there are I have a lot of things listed here, and these are all very important, but there are two I really want to point to. The first one is tire wear particles. So tire wear particles, in addition to some things like chemical additives like 6-PPD or 6-PPDQ, which my colleague Andrew Patterson will be talking about in 2 weeks. Stay tuned for that. Tire wear particles are also attributed to a large amount of microplastic induction into the natural environment on an annual basis. Now, I pointed to contention earlier, though. The modeled studies around tire wear particles put the total input into our environments anywhere between 5% to 50% on an annual basis. So that's an order of magnitude. And while nobody is going to discount that it is a very important source of microplastic contamination in our environments, understanding the most impact we can have really does rely on having sensitive measurements around a lot of these induction areas. So when you have numbers citing anywhere from 5 to 50% of microplastic induction, there's a lot of question as to which of those models that we're using are the most accurate to allow us to understand this full scope of the situation that we're dealing with. The other thing I want to point to here is wastewater. Wastewater is a very something a personal passion of mine, but maybe some of you understand the wastewater treatment process, but all of our wastewater is routed to a wastewater treatment plant, and there have been studies done on the removal efficiency of microplastics in wastewater. And those studies cite anywhere between 70 to 99% of microplastics removed by wastewater treatment, which is fantastic until you consider a few things. First of all, when you start to look at the nanoplastic range, again, 1 nanometer to about 999 nanometers, the removal efficiency drops significantly. These systems just aren't designed to remove physical contaminants to that size threshold. And that becomes very important when you consider that the nanoplastics are perhaps the most biologically significant in terms of human and ecological health. The second thing about wastewater treatment is the microplastics are sorbed into biosolids. And what happens to those biosolids is incredibly important. Biosolids traditionally are either land applied, incinerated, or used as fertilizer. So what you're doing, and you're not actually removing these from the environment. You're just concentrating and moving them to a different source. So it's not complete removal. And it's entirely possible that as these microplastics in these locations continue to shear and move and fragment in these locations, they can exit some of the physical mechanisms we use to contain them and re-enter the environment. So it is an incredibly complex problem that we are ultimately dealing with here. So then we start to get into how do these actually move within our environment? And I think this is one of the most interesting and underappreciated aspects of microplastics contamination. Because at the end of the day, the short answer is it moves through every natural system that we have. When you look at aqueous environments, there are a lot of sources of microplastics contamination, from secondary microplastics to inefficient removals of nanoplastics through wastewater processes and then deposition of that back into natural environments. These are entering our natural water pathways at a staggering rate. And they have literally been detected in every drinking water source globally. It's incredible. In fact, there was a study that found microplastics in water samples down in the Mariana Trench. These are literally everywhere. Then you start to look into soils and sediments. And while they may not move as quickly through these matrices as water, they are moving through the soil environments as well. Microplastics have been shown to be uptook by groundwater plumes and move through our natural groundwater cycles. And early research has shown potential for some plants to uptake a certain size threshold of nanoplastics into their root systems and distribute that within the plant itself. So soils and sediments are a very important and growing area of research in this field. And then you look into atmosphere. So it has been shown that a lot of these fibers will travel thousands of miles, thousands of kilometers from a lot of different emission sources. There are industrial emission sources. One of that has gained attention recently is through laundromats or high laundry areas at hotels where microfibers, especially the fibrous material, not like circular, but fibrous material, have been shown to enter air quality or enter our air through these sources. And then ultimately, it comes down to biota. It's the exposure of our animals and ourselves. It has been shown that on every level of the food chain that these microplastics have been ingested, and there is potential for what is called bioaccumulation. Bioaccumulation basically means the concentration of a certain contaminant will increase in species as it goes farther and farther up the food chain. So fish eat microplastics, then a bear eats fish and ingests all of the microplastics that are contained within that fish, having a higher load than the fish itself. But ultimately, we are also part of that chain. And I'll get into this in a little bit, but we have detected microplastics in practically every tissue sample that has been analyzed for human purposes. So we are not casual observers to this crisis. We are an inherent part of this pathway. So I'm really excited to get into the human exposure talk in a little bit here. But first, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Bijan as he walks through some of the laboratory applications of microplastics analysis. Excuse me.
Thank you so much, Adam. So microplastics methods are starting to move toward harmonization, but the field is still evolving. And I'll be covering a few of the main published methods that form the foundation for consistent and defensible work. First, we have well, is my slide moving? Let's see. Oh, there you go. All right. First, we have the two methods used in California's statewide microplastics monitoring program. These came out in 2022 and require strict contamination control. Both follow the State Water Board's reporting framework, which includes particle count, size beans, polymer assignment, and minimum detectable amounts. And now within that framework, there are two main approaches. MP1 is the IR-based, infrared-based method. It uses technologies such as FDIR, LDIR, or OPTIR, or any other IR instrument that can measure particles at or above 50 microns. And then MP2 uses Raman spectroscopy for particle measurement and identification, and it applies to particles greater than 20 microns. And that's how California approaches it. And then if we zoom out a bit, there are also international standards that follow a very similar structure. ISO 16094 gives detailed laboratory procedures for analyzing microplastics in clean and low solids water, including drinking water. And part two explains how to use the spectroscopic techniques to identify and count particles. And it covers size measurements, particle classifications, polymer identifications, and the minimum measurable size is about 1 to 5 microns for Raman and around 20 microns for FTIR. In practice, the workflow looks very similar to what we just discussed. It uses filtrations to capture particles, which are then examined under the microscope, paired with FTIR or Raman. And this let us determine the particle count and the particle level details that we can capture from um, these techniques. And looking ahead, part three, which is still in draft, shifts the focus a bit. It covers the analytical methods like pyrolysis GCMS and thermal desorption GCMS, and these measure polymer mass instead of individual particles. Now, stepping back a little further, there are also broader standards that guide how all of this should be done. ISO 24187, it's not a step-by-step laboratory method, but it lays out the principles and definitions that guide how microplastics should be sampled, prepared, and analyzed. It covers general ideas like size classes and terminology, some contamination control aspects in there as well, and it helps you choose the right analytical technique based on the intention behind your testing. It also explains common preparation steps such as digestion, filtration, and density separation. And it, as I said, it kind of like acts as the foundation that helps lab build defensible workflows. In addition to that, we have ISTM that also developed the standards that support microplastics working water. The 8332 covers how to collect water samples with different solid levels. The 8333 explains how to prepare those samples, including the preparation steps that we just talked about. And both of these are flexible and can feed into both the spectroscopic techniques and thermoanalytical measurements. And then finally, there is NOAA's 2015 method, which is still widely used, especially for marine waters and sediments. It includes the preparation techniques and filtration. And although it's older, it remains one of the most referenced procedures for sediment and biota. Here, I'll walk you through the methodologies that are available. It's a detailed style, so bear with me here. Up top, you see the size range we consider for micro and nanoplastics, which is about 1 nanometer to 5 millimeters. It's a wide range, and not all of it is reachable with the standard methods. And that's why California's drinking water method begins validated detections at 20 microns. Um, the microplastic analysis in general can be broken into two parts. You have physical characterization, which tells us the particle level details such as size, shape, and color, and then chemical characterization that tells us the polymer type. And starting with the spectroscopy, at our Sacramento lab, we use Raman. It's well suited for smaller particles and can identify down to about 1 micron depending on conditions. With our system at the quality control workflow that we established for this testing. We consistently analyze drinking water samples down to 5 microns. And Raman also gives you particle level data, such as number, size, shape, type, color, and also characterizes the polymers as well. So you'll know the type of polymer that you're getting. And then FTIR is another common method and works best for particles above 20 micron, which is why it aligns with California's approach. Then we have LDIR, which is an automated version of FTIR. It offers a quicker throughput in a similar size range, generally around 10 to 20 micron. That's how small the technology could detect. And then there is OPTIR. We had this technology tested in our lab. It's really exciting because it pushes below that 1 micron boundary. I think it would go down to about 200 to 300 nanometers. But I mean, going smaller always comes with a cost at the commercial testing scale, the workflow from sample preparation through analysis, the quality control parameters that has to get in place. All of these require a lot of time and resources. But I mean, we are working through that and hoping that we can have that level established in our department, so we can acquire this unit sometime in the future. And all of these techniques rely on how particles interact with light. So thickness, color, surface structure, I mean, they can all affect your results. If you take black tire as an example, they are challenging for optical systems because they tend to absorb the light and technically they burn uh, under your laser. So therefore, you're not going to be able to get a valid spectrum out of those particles. Oh, excuse me, way too fast. Then we have the thermal methods like pyrolysis GCMS or thermal desorption GCMS. These don't analyze individual particles. Instead, the whole filter is heated, all the plastic breaks down, and the vapor is analyzed, which gives you the total plastic content, but you don't get the particle level details from that, so you don't get the size, shape, or count. And if you had to choose between the two, I mean, again, your intention is matter. If you need particle level detail, spectroscopy is the way to go. And then if you need total plastic content, thermal methods are faster and more effective. Here's a quick breakdown on how we use Raman spectroscopy in the lab. We start off with a laser and direct it right at each particle. It's a single wavelength beam, usually green at 532 nanometers or red at 785. And it acts as our energy source. So what it does is that it excites the molecules and gets everything started. And when the laser interacts with the sample, most of the light is just bounces back without changing energy. And that's called Rayleigh scattering, which is expected, but it's not really useful for our purposes. And what we actually care about is the small portion of light that comes back with a shift in energy, and that's Raman scattering. That shift happens because the light interacts with the vibrations in the molecules, and it gives us really specific information about the particles' molecular structure. Next step is filtering. This is where the strong Rayleigh signal gets blocked out using optical filters, so only the weaker Raman signal makes it through. And from there, the filtered light is sent into the spectrometer where it gets dispersed. It gets detected by a CCD and turns into a Raman spectrum. And finally, we compare that spectrum against our polymer library to identify what we are looking at. I mean, as we can see here, we have PTFEM and polyestyrene examples here. And each polymer's spectrum is unique to that polymer. You can think of this as almost like a fingerprint. And this acquired spectrum will run against our established reference library, and it would give you a match score. And that's how you can detect the particles and characterize them. And walking through pyrolysis GCMS, this is a little bit different compared to spectroscopy. As I said, because instead of looking at the particle, we are essentially taking it apart and reading the pieces. It starts with sample input. we weigh a known mass of particles or filter residue into a small quartz or metal pyrolysis cup. And that known mass is important because it's what lets us quantify later on. Then comes the pyrolysis step itself. We heat the sample very rapidly under an inert gas, and that heat cleaves the polymer chains into a smaller, characteristic volatile fragments, and that's what we call pyrolysates. And the key here is that each polymer breaks apart in its own signature way. From there, those pyrolysates gets carried onto a capillary GC column. They get separated out by retention time. So now we have gone from one complex mixture to a nicely spread out series of compounds. And each of those eluting peaks then passes into the mass spectrometer, where it records the mass spectrum, and we track the specific marker ions by their mass to charge ratio, which gives us the identification ultimately. Technically, we confirmed the polymer using three things: the retention time pattern, the marker ions, and comparison against the library or a known standard. So it's not just one data point, it's covering a set of evidence. And the real strength of this technique is the quantification, because we started with a known mass and we have calibrated those marker peaks. We can convert peak area directly into a polymer specific mass and normalize it back to the sample. As you can see in the pyrogram examples here, polyethylene gives us those repeating hydrocarbon homolog peaks. It's a very regular, evenly spaced pattern, but polypropylene shows a more branch fragment pattern, and each one is distinct. That's exactly what it is. Tell these polymers apart and put real numbers behind them. Now, let's talk about how we actually analyze microplastics and why it's not as straightforward as it might seem. This is one of the most complex types of analysis that we have ever worked with. The reason is simple, because we are not looking for just one thing. We are trying to answer several questions at the same time. We want to know the number of particles, their size and type, and also in some cases, morphology and color, because all of these details matter. Morphology, for example, can point us toward the source, where a bead may suggest the primary microplastics, as Adam was explaining, and but a fiber or fragment usually points to secondary breakdown, and this helps us to understand where it came from and how it got into the sample. So in a perfect world, from one analysis, we are trying to collect 5 different pieces of information, and each one asks the story of what's the sample and where it may have come from. Um, in in regards to the nurdles that Adam was talking about, we had a project. We had a railroad spill of nurdles, and they had them collected alongside the railroad, and um, we had those analyzed, and we confirmed the plastic type that they were, and by the shape of them, they could kind of understand which company it came from, and um, well, I'm not going to talk about the legal aspect of it, but this is it kind of like it helps to understand the source of the materials that you're finding. So how are we actually having this analyzed? Testing starts with sample collections. This is one of the most critical stages. Microplastics are everywhere, so the risk of contamination is high. That's why we use pre-treated clean bottles that we have validated to be free of microplastics. And once the client sends the samples back, we inspect everything and rinse the outside of the containers with microplastics analysis grade water to remove any external contamination. We also offer guidance to samplers, such as avoiding synthetic clothing or anything that could shed during the sampling event. And then we move into sample preparation, which depends on the matrix. If it's drinking water, we can often filter it directly. But if it's a solid or an environmental water sample, we need to break down the matrix by using oxidation to remove organics and density separation to isolate the microplastics. And once the particles are isolated, we transfer the final filter onto a slide and bring it to the instrument for Raman analysis. And all of these steps follow the established practices that we talked about, and they align with ISO, ISTM, and the state programs such as California Water Boards. Here is an overview of the bottles and sample types we use for water matrices. We provide pre-treated 1 liter bottles with metal caps and foil liner. Again, the intention is to avoid plastic use entirely. And for environmental samples, you see a typical example in the third image. And when it comes to consumer products, we prefer to receive them in their original packaging to avoid contamination or particle loss. And again, every material is carefully chosen to reduce the risk of shedding. One thing that is not included here, we also provide 4-ounce jars with metal caps. These are clear glass jars that go through the same pre-treatment process just to make sure that we are not introducing any background or any contamination to the samples. This is the typical preparation workflow for that we use for drinking water samples. There is no digestion or density separation needed here. We use a 15 by 15 millimeter silicone filter. It's that darkest square that you see sitting in the petri dish. The effective filtration area is 13.5 and 13 by 13.5 millimeter. And that entire filtration area gets scanned to capture all the filtered particles. And after the filtration, the filter becomes the substrate holding the particles that we are going to analyze. It's carefully transferred onto a clean microscope slide and stored in a petri dish to keep it protected from contamination. And again, that final filter is what goes to the instrument for Raman analysis. And I'll hand it back to you, Adam.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bijan. So one of the things I love about this presentation is as we continue to get farther and farther down the slides here, a lot of the questions that we're going to be talking about are much more contested. So ultimately, when we're talking about microplastics, what we're really worried about is the impacts to both ecological and human health. And arguably, human health has been one of the areas of this field that over the last 5 years has seen an incredible increase in attention, both in terms of the research that's being published around this space and the growing call within the general population for these contaminants to be better understood and regulated. So when we look at the human health impacts of the various microplastics, we start to see a very concerning trend start to emerge. Now, the first thing we need to look at is what tissue samples, what in vivo matrices have these microplastics actually been detected in? And when you look at the literature, what you start to see is absolutely striking. I mean, we have seen detection in lungs, in the cardiovascular system, heart and arteries, liver, kidney, within reproductive organs. In fact, a very impactful study came out recently that saw incredible attention around the detection of microplastics in testes. And we've also seen them detected in thyroid, in placenta, both on the mother's side and the fetal side of the placenta, in breast milk, and in blood. Now, if you've had your finger on the pulse on this, you'll note that there's another study that I'm kind of omitting from this, but we'll get into that in a second. The important thing to note here is microplastics have been detected very commonly in many of the different tissue samples that we observe in the human body. Now, what does this mean for the resulting health implications? That is where the question starts to get a little more shaky. So there was a study published in, I believe it was 2023, that looked at microplastics specifically in the cardiovascular system. And what this study showed was that microplastics that were found in patients in the arterial plaque of patients, those patients had a higher risk of adverse cardiovascular events, heart attack, stroke, death, than individuals that did not have high levels of microplastics detected in that arterial plaque, which is a very important correlation. But the paper stopped short of causation. And that's a very, very important aspect to consider. because if you ever have a free moment, I would really suggest you go and look at this website called Spurious Correlations. And what this website does is kind of a humorous way. They take this big data set that they've compiled and they do something called data dredging. And through the data dredging, they're able to find correlations of very unrelated things to high rates, like R value of 0.99 for things like the number of civil engineering degrees awarded in the United States compared to cheese consumption in Wisconsin. Two things that obviously have no association, but are very highly correlated. And so why do I bring that up? Well, because correlation does not imply causation. And that's a very, very important aspect. So where does that land with us now? Well, in terms of microplastics, what it means is there has been enough observed correlation, enough evidence to suggest that the problem is pervasive and serious enough that it warrants continued investigation. It doesn't mean that the science is incorrect. It doesn't mean that the research is invalid. But what it does mean is that our understanding is not where it needs to be. We are at a gap right now between what we know and what we need to know to truly understand the human health impacts of microplastics. So then we'll get to another study that obtained remarkable notoriety, both in the field and in the public sphere. There was a study published in a highly reputable journal in Nature Medicine back in February of 2025. So just under 18 months ago. And this study observed microplastics in three matrices, three organs in the body, one of them being human brain samples. And they found staggering amounts of microplastics within the brain. They did a pyrolysis GCMS approach to their research and also did a temporal analysis, looking at brain samples, brain slices from 2016 to 2024. And they found a very large, statistically significant increase in the microplastics from 2016 to 2024, which lined up and correlated with the increased production of plastics globally. So this was a massive study. Overnight, this paper achieved international recognition. It was on, public news channels globally. The researchers were being interviewed for this. In fact, the last time I looked at it, the number of citations on this paper was just shy of 1,000. I think I looked at it maybe a month ago. So at this point in time, that paper has most likely exceeded 1,000 citations in under 18 months. And if you've ever done any type of peer-reviewed publication, you can appreciate how incredible having your paper cited in 2 years at a level of 1,000 is. It's virtually unheard of. It is very rare for a peer-reviewed paper to receive that much attention. So the researchers were very happy. But then, just a little bit later, there was a formal Matters Arising article published in the same paper. And what Matters Arising is in Nature journals is a formal contesting to any type of peer-reviewed publication that has been published. So 9 experts in this field got together, co-wrote this Matters Arising document and published it in Nature. And their main concerns were 2. First of all, from the available data, it didn't appear that the authors of the original paper accounted for the known lipid interference in pyrolysis GC systems for polyethylene. So PE, or polyethylene, was the dominant microplastic found in the brain samples. But because of how lipids or other high long chain fatty acids behave in the pyrolysis GC system, high presence of these compounds in a sample can cause a false positive or interference with the polyethylene. The second problem that they had is there was a lack of standardized QA/QC procedures like method blanks that traditionally would be required for any type of peer-reviewed paper published in an analytical, environmental, or analytical chemistry journal. So these experts came forth and said there are significant methodological problems with this paper. The original authors then published a rebute to that in the same journal. They acknowledged some of the limitations that were stated, but ultimately came to the decision or the opinion that further development in the field was necessary, especially around some of these aspects. So where does that land us today? Well, it is unresolved. If you dig into the debate around this topic, there are credentialed experts that sit on both sides of this issue. So again, what does that ultimately mean for the science? It does not mean that the science is invalid. It does not mean that the science is incorrect. But what it does mean is it is important to understand the limitations of any type of methodology that you are applying to a problem when viewing the data. Because if you don't account for the limitations, you may end up at an incorrect conclusion. And that's important because that gap, again, between what we know and what we need to know is still significant. It's closing, but I might argue it's not closing quite fast enough. Then we get into another really interesting, contentiously debated aspect of the microplastics field. Because ultimately, the potential of harm from a microplastic is more than just the plastic material itself. Now, there is the physical particle, that small microplastic that is sheared down to a nanoplastic size, potentially crossing different biological barriers in your body, interacting in vivo, and causing potentially some adverse health outcomes. So there's the physical particle, but as I alluded to earlier in the presentation, that's not the only mechanism that we necessarily need to be worried about here. There is also the chemical vector. So the chemical vector is the idea that as these microplastics move through the environment, that their surface may have a specific affinity for absorbing other contaminants within the environment. And this has actually been shown that microplastics can absorb our other well-known friend, the PFAS compounds. So if these microplastics absorb various contaminants within our environment, migrate to our bodies, there's a potential that it's not only the microplastic itself, but the chemicals that have been absorbed throughout the environment that may also cause a health impact. But again, this is a debated aspect of the field because some experts say that there is no mechanism for desorbing that contaminant in vivo within the body. So again, this is an area where you have credentialed experts sitting on both sides of the equation, but the evidence that sits in front of us today dictates that this is a concern that warrants continued investigation. And then there is the biological vector. So if you know like wastewater treatment systems, or even, I guess the example I like to give is your water bottle. If you have your water bottle and you're not washing it out frequently enough, which, hey, I'm kind of guilty of that sometimes, there is an inside slime that kind of develops on the surface, the interior surface of your water bottle. And what that is a biofilm. It is a microbial community that is growing in a specific environment. And these microplastics can also grow these microbial communities on the surface of the microplastic, and then potentially having these microbial communities enter the body through the microplastic particle. So what we're talking about is 3 separate threat vectors contained in a single contaminant. This is unlike anything that the environmental field has truly dealt with before. But again, a lot of these mechanisms are debated, they are contested. So there's enough evidence to suggest it could be an issue, and we need to understand it in much better detail. So then we start to look at the regulatory drive and where this field is moving. Because I said it earlier in the presentation, the environmental field is driven primarily through 2 mechanisms, regulation and litigation. And it's very reasonable to assume that both of these vehicles will drive the growth of microplastics over the next few decades. But as you know, when you look at where we are, and again, microplastics is a very nascent field. We didn't really start to look at matrices outside of marine environments until about 2015, thereabout. So when you think about the true drive of this field in terms of the ubiquitous environment has only been about 10 years. We're starting to see a lot of the regulatory movement that we've seen with a lot of other contaminants historically, like leaded gasoline, DDT, asbestos, and now we're moving into the PFAS, where we've seen a partial regulation being driven around this with, somewhere below 50 contaminants with the potential, thousands upon thousands of PFAS contaminants that could be in our environment and, we're being exposed to. So in 2015, we saw the US ban of microbeads and rinse-off cosmetics. That was mirrored by a lot of other countries, especially in the early 2020s and beyond. And then we start to see, California mandating, the European Union restricting microplastics through the REACH Act. There was also a global treaty on microplastics that was developed. And that has met a lot of resistance and hurdles. That was kind of unanticipated. That movement hasn't quite reached the trajectory that people had hoped, but it's still ongoing. And then in 2025, the FDA bipartisan bill introduced to Congress around this. And then in 2026, we've started to see a lot of interesting movement in this field. And it occurred back, the first, movement occurred back in April of this year, when EPA and HHS got together on a joint press release to note two things. First of all, was the inclusion of microplastics on the CCL 6 list, which was very notable. And then the second one was the development of the HHS STOMP initiative, which was a funded ARPA-H grant program specifically around the development of instrumentation and methodology to identify microplastic body burden and then reduce microplastic body burden. But if you're following this field closely, something really, really interesting came out just this week. So in terms of the CCL6, what that is, it's a list of contaminants that the EPA is considering for inclusion on the UCMR6, or the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring List. So the EPA came out very recently and stated that microplastics would not be included on UCMR6 while they were included in CCL. And a lot of people came out and said, oh no, this is a mistake. This was the wrong choice. The EPA made a bad decision here. But it's important to understand, again, I don't view this, and Bijan and I were talking before about this, Bijan also doesn't view this as a setback in the field. In fact, this is exactly what we were expecting. Because in order for a contaminant to be included on the UCMR, and my colleague Taryn McKnight made this point earlier today to me, in order for a contaminant to be included on UCMR 6, there has to be two pre-existing conditions is the wrong word, but two qualifiers. First of all, there has to be an EPA method for the contaminant. And secondly, there has to be enough capacity for this monitoring program to realistically be able to move forward with the speed that is necessary. And neither of those two things, as it sits today, exists. So it's not a setback. This is exactly what we were expecting. And it still indicates forward movement in the field, because what inclusion in CCL6 means is that there will be additional, most likely, there will be potential for additional funding mechanisms to continue to drive the necessary research around both the development of standardized methods and better understanding of the true scope of contamination across our environment. So this is positive momentum forward, guys. This is fantastic movement forward. It's following the trajectory that many, many contaminants that are now squarely in the regulatory space have followed. And there's no reason to believe that microplastics will not continue along this trajectory. But I want to take a step back from the regulatory decision. I mean, I know that that's very important, and that ultimately governs a lot of the work that we all do. But I like to frame it in terms of what regulation actually is. Because in my mind, and you feel free to disagree with me, but regulation is not a hurdle to overcome. Regulation isn't the cost of doing business. At its best form, regulation is society deciding that it has had enough with a certain way that we have historically been approaching something, and that we need to do something to rectify the mistakes that we have made. And I believe that the general consensus that we've reached is that we have had enough. Not just with microplastics, but the way that we develop products. The linear model. You make it, you use it, you throw it away. Now, why do I say this? Well, I'm a very avid outdoors person. In fact, if money was no issue, I'd be a mountain man somewhere, and you'd never have heard of me before. So every time I go out to a forest, or I live in Arizona, so we go out to the desert a lot, I take a look around. So next time you're out in the natural environment, the beauty of this world that we live in, take a look around and try to find waste. Not the trash that we leave behind, but waste as part of the natural environment. What you're going to find is it doesn't exist. The fallen leaf becomes soil, the dead animal becomes fertilizer, everything is conserved, nothing is wasted. It is a pure circular system. And yet, we have developed a linear model, not only for microplastics, but virtually everything we develop. And we gave it no place in that system. Now, it's important to note, there have been some really interesting studies looking at things like microbial communities that can degrade some of these plastics, but it's not happening at any type of biological scale that is meaningful for us. And that's very important. So as we move forward, the challenge that we have is not going to be what the next material is, but it's how we can design systems that inherently align with the natural environment's cyclical systems, the circular systems, so we do not continue to engage in these problems going forward. So we started today in the 1800s of change in ivory, or a new material to replace ivory. We went through the plastic age, one of arguably the greatest inventions in human history. And today we live with the full burden of that problem. Now, I'm not going to sit here today and tell you that we need to be anti-plastics. That's not a position that is rooted in any semblance of reality. Plastics have a use. They have an important use. Single-use plastics have arguably saved tens, if not 100 millions of lives in the surgical suite globally. The single-use plastics in a neonatal ICU unit are not a luxury. My own daughter was saved by them. Go ahead and tell me that that's a luxury that we can afford to live without. We can't. But we can both celebrate the successes that the plastic revolution has provided us, and at the same time demand a fundamentally different relationship with this material that now governs our lives. And that is the challenge ahead of us. You know, at Eurofins here, I feel incredibly lucky to work for a company that views the microplastics conversation not as a market opportunity, but as a bona fide scientific application that we must pursue, not as, again, a market opportunity, not as an addition to the P&L, but as something that is inherent to improving the quality of life of humans globally. You know, we do a lot of analytical testing here. We're one of the largest, if not the largest, TIC companies globally. And we test for compliance, you know, we test for safety, we test for accountability. But at the end of the day, everything is done for the greater good. We ultimately test for life. So thank you all so much for joining us here today. We really, really appreciate it. And if there are any questions that we could answer for you, we'd be happy to do that. Again, thank you all so much.
Adam and Bijan, thank you. A great presentation. There is one question that came up in the question function. I don't know if you see that. Do you have any insight into silicone microparticles since silicone is a common plastic substitute?
I
Yeah,
can talk
that's
into that a little bit. I mean,
please go ahead, Bijan.
it was about a month ago that I attended a conference, and one of the presenters was actually talking about silicon as well. In terms of, I mean, it silicon microparticles. I mean, they sit in a bit of a gray area. They behave like polymer particles, but many of the programs they don't really classify them in the same way as the
Mhm.
conventional microplastics right now. So the the analytical techniques that I talked about, they can certainly identify them. It's just that I think they have to be reported as a separate target
Yeah.
rather than being combined with microplastics. And because again, these programs they don't really talk about silicon. I mean, I don't really have much insight on what's being done in terms of the analytical techniques. I think it's um, it's a step behind microplastics as different industries are trying to raise more of awareness into this, but it hasn't really, at least to my knowledge, it hasn't really made its way into any of the government programs or any of the utilities looking or testing for it.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there, Bijan. I mean, it's really there is an in terms of literature right now anyway, there is an increased focus on it today. I there was one paper, I think it was a Frontiers in Chemistry paper that was published maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And it was more so an analytical methodology paper that looked specifically at the silicone microparticles. Excuse me. And so primarily methodology that I think they used Raman spectroscopy, and they said, here's a methodology, we validated it. And then they did, if I'm remembering correctly, they did a rough calculation around silicone sealants in a kitchen setting, and said that this could potentially be a source of both micro and nanoplastics. But yeah, especially with the regulatory drivers that have been occurring right now. You have to develop, any one of these methodologies is targeted. You have to benchmark it against reference standards. So if there's not deliberate inclusion within the methodologies, it's just not going to be reported. But again, it's really important as well, because you think back to the regrettable substitution. It's a term that you hear a lot. Like bisphenol A is a good example of that. Widely replaced by, I believe, bisphenol S and bisphenol F. Bisphenol A is an endocrine disruptor compound, primarily estrogenic. And what early research is showing right now is those products that we replaced bisphenol A with have a lot of the same endocrine disrupting potential as bisphenol A did. So, you switch the molecular formula of a product, it's no longer this product anymore. It is used in mass, and then we run into the exact same problem. So again, that's it points to that importance of truly understanding, and developing these things from like the circular mindset, as opposed to the linear model, and just continuing to kick this can down the road with new and new products that we will be worried about in 10 years. We have to stop that process.
There are a couple other questions. I don't know if you can see those, if you want to tackle those questions.
So yeah. So anonymous attendee asked, is there any way to completely remove or disintegrate plastics both physically and the macro level? So this, again, it's really an emerging aspect of the science right now, of the field. There are groups that are looking at culturing, various microbial communities that can use the plastic particles as their electron source, so their energy source, essentially. So, this is, and we've observed these things occurring in the natural environment, over 100 years or so of exposure to plastics. Some microbial communities have evolved the capability to be able to use plastics for energy purposes. Again, naturally, it's not occurring on any level that is significant to us. From a geologic time, frame, yeah, I mean, eventually it would be dealt with. But the question is, are we going to be here, or most likely not. So then, it comes into like bioengineering these things. Can we realistically create a considerable amount of these and culture these in the locations that is necessary for the removal of these contaminants? And then you also have to back end that with, can you also keep them out of specific environments where, induction of these, like in a surgical suite or a neonatal ICU unit, where you need the single-use plastics and you need the plastics, where disintegration of these plastics would be catastrophic and result in the loss of human life. So there is a lot of interesting research coming out around this space, but again, like this field, it's probably even more nascent. It's more infant than even the methodologies we've been able to develop over the last 10 years.
Great, thank
And
you.
yeah, yeah. And then Rob, you know what? I don't know about graphene. So Robert asked, how about graphene? Um, Honestly, Robert, I don't know. Um, but thank you for the question. Bijan, do you have any insight into graphene?
Not really. Although, I mean, like, I'm thinking whether we can even apply the spectroscopy methods to
It,
capture them, because I mean, it would probably it's going to be hard to distinguish it between carbon or
yeah,
everything else, because the signatures are
yeah.
pretty much similar. So, um, yeah, that's the only thing that I can comment on.
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely be a different analytical method that we'd need to apply to that. And but I mean, honestly, I that's not an area of the research that I've dug too heavily into. So I appreciate your question. You can feel free to send me an email. I can do some research and get back to you on that.
Great, great, thank you. I don't see any other questions, and we will include with your presentations all your contact information, if that's okay. Participants can reach out to you offline. But I did want to see if you wanted to plug, not to put you on the spot. We have another Eurofins webinar coming up in a couple of weeks, a dive into PPDQ. Any thoughts on that, or anything you want to pitch
Absolutely,
on that?
absolutely. So yeah, in 2 weeks, our colleague Andrew Patterson will be presenting on this forum on a 6-ppd quinone. And this is a chemical that is included as a tire additive that is really on the emerging side of environmental research. It's been shown to have adverse health impacts to specific aquatic species. And with the vast use of tires globally, there is significant potential for this to be a very important contaminant as we move forward. So come back in 2 weeks. Andrew Patterson is a fantastic presenter. You're going to love him, and learn a little bit about 6-ppd and 6-ppdq.
Great, great. And I think there was one more thing here, one more last question, if you just want to touch on that one,
Okay, sure.
and
Yeah.
then we'll wrap it up.
Sounds great. So it says, as we progress technologically, could we make and use plastics in a way that is not detrimental to health? Boy, that's a big question. My answer is, I hope so. I, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. There are companies right now that are engaging in developing, plastics that are, plastic alternatives that are easily biodegraded. Um, it's certainly well within the realm of possibility, and there's strong evidence to support that the field is moving in that direction from like the material development standpoint, not the analytical testing standpoint, but materials manufacturing. There's a lot of strong evidence to suggest that they're moving in that direction. Um, there's a lot of caveats, I think, with that. One of them is, and again, I want to be abundantly clear about this. There is sufficient evidence to suggest that these are potential human health impacts. There are serious human health impacts, but in a lot of cases, causality has not been demonstrated robustly, and it requires increased attention, increased research into these areas. So that's very important. And then the second thing, of course, is to my point before of regrettable substitution. So, we have to make sure that the alternatives that we are replacing these plastics with are not going to result in the same or worse health impacts as we move down the road, which is a very, very important but potentially onerous aspect to overcome. So we can do it, we can, but it's going to require deliberate action in order to achieve that.
Great. Okay. Again, with that, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Bijan, and Eurofins for participating, and thank you for participating. Those of you that are still remain on the webinar, and we'll get the link to the video soon as well as the handouts. So with that, have a great day.
Goodbye.